So, what is the meaning of all this?
Може да почнеме.
Yep. Okay. I think we're all here, as I can see. Yes. Okay. First of all, thank you, Anna, for inviting me to be a moderator of this international conference about film and philosophy. I really do these types of things. It seems to me the more I speak, the better off we all are. Thank you to all our speakers before. It was really nice hearing about thought processes, time travel, dream sequences as they correlate to film and philosophy. For our second session, we have 5 speakers also. 1 from Turkey, 2 from Macedonia, 1 from Bulgaria, and 1 from Poland. The first one is our first and only keynote speaker for this session is Professor Serdar Öztürk from Turkey. He will be speaking about cinephilosophy and the new way of doing philosophy. And just to get his info and bio, he has a PhD, of course. He's a professor at the Department of Radio, Television, and Cinema at the Faculty of Communication in Ankara, HPV University. He's a founder and publisher and editor of the journal Cinephilosophy in Turkey. And he will be talking to us about his subject, which is cinephilosophy, a new way of doing philosophy. As I said earlier, he has 40 minutes, and Professor Öztürk, the virtual floor is yours. You may proceed.
Thank you. First of all, let me show a PowerPoint screen. I hope you can see it.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
It's clear.
Okay. First of all, I would like to thank to the Philosophical Society of Macedonia and Philosophical Film Festival organization team for inviting me to make a speech in this distinguished philosophy and film conference. I would like to start with a simple but a very distinguished question. How can we construct the relationship between cinema and philosophy? What is the best way of making a distinction between philosophy and cinema? Or do we think that, in fact, there is indeed a philosophy, but there are different ways of doing philosophy? If so, can we think that film can do philosophy in its own way, technique, and through its own medium? I would like to discuss these questions in my presentation. First, I want to start with the meaning of cinema and philosophy in order to pass my argument. What is cinema? Of course, there are many definitions. It is a big question, but to put it simply, in my belief, cinema can be thought of as a composition. What kind of composition? As Deleuze said, movement images and time images produced by camera movement, camera angles, shots, frames, angles, color, sound, lighting, screenplay, and acting. Gilles Deleuze classified images in cinema as basically, as you know, two main images, movement images and time images. For me, we can use a short description to classify these images. Cine images. Cinema is made with cine images. And the second question, what is philosophy? Of course, there are many definitions of philosophy. Kant characterized philosophy as the attempt to answer these basic questions. What can I do? What should I do? What can I hope for? And Deleuze and Guattari claims philosophy creating concepts. Philosophy does not question everything according to them. Wherever it finds a problem, philosophy reflects on it. Alain Badiou as well thinks that philosophy considers paradoxes. If there isn't a relationship between some things, philosophy reflects on this. And finally, Henry Bergson claimed doing philosophy means an intervention in common or usual thinking. In daily life, we think that we think. But in fact, it is a common sense. We should get away from ordinary thinking in order to engage in philosophical thinking. As you see, these philosophers put on emphasis on the problem. In philosophical thinking, there must be a problem. So here is a problem. On the one hand, cinema is made with cine images. On the other hand, philosophy is done by concepts. What kind of relation can we see between them? Is it possible to bring cine images and concepts, cinema and philosophy side by side? Plato claimed, claimed that images mislead us. Images are outside of the real world. For him, for Plato, concepts or ideas, belong to the true world, fundamental world, the world of ideas. Plato himself believed that since art imitates physical things, which in turn imitate the forms, art is always a copy of a copy. And art always leads us, even further from the truth and toward illusion. According to Plato, work of art are at best entertainment and at worst a dangerous delusion. Philosophy, for him, enlightens us and tries to help us to get away from the delusion of images. A great many philosophers agree with Plato about the image issue. According to them, images and concepts or truth are against each other. As Badiou claims, if there is a relationship between philosophy and cinema, this might be a hate relationship. Hate. Philosophy, throughout its history, has hated images, and to some extent, still keeps this position. From these explanations, we can easily understand the reason why many philosophers generally reject cinema in favor of thinking and concepts. They believe that cinematic images can distract attention from the full intellectual and logical universe. Cinematic images belong to, entertainment or the art world. They may objectify some philosophical concepts at best. The second problem I would like to put forward is the opposition between art and the mass appeals of cinema. Assessing this paradox, Badiou calls cinema a mass art, as you know. What is mass art? Films are loved by millions of people all around the world at the moment they were made. At this point, the key expression here, at the moment. Of course, millions of people can go to ancient historical places. But in the case of movies, okay. Sometimes you can forget some things. Okay, sorry. While we are focusing, we are forgetting everything. Okay, now probably I am here. The second problem I would like to put forward is the opposition, art and mass, mass appeals. Films are loved by millions of people. And the key expression at the moment. Millions of people can go to historical places. Yeah, yes, but they are not at the time. Charlie Chaplin's movies were watched by people all around the world. At the time his films were made. Today, Christopher Nolan's Interstellar can be watched all around the world, in every corner, even on cell phones by millions. In the movie, we witness the genetic elements which are profound and essential for all human beings. All people actually depend on the fate of the world, our home. Our home, the world, is much important than our daily issues, our political or economic clashes with each other. This film presents the fundamental element for us. The mass dimension of movies can reflect and construct a generic humanity, as Alain Badiou said. Cinema not only has mass dimension, it is also an art. This double regime of cinema, meaning mass and art, is a paradoxical relationship. Mass is both an industrial and also political category. The culture industry produces products and distributes them to people all around the world. But mass at the same time implies a political activism. Today, people can get together both in physical and virtual spaces in order to resist political pressures. To the contrary, art basically belongs to aristocratic category. Why? Because art includes creating aesthetic and artful products, and not everyone can tackle this. Besides, understanding the meaning of art requires education to a certain extent. In brief, cinema belongs to the political and industrial category on the one hand, and aristocratic category on the other hand. This is a paradoxical relationship. What is the meaning of this paradoxical relationship? Philosophy focuses on paradoxes, as I have said before. Wherever philosophy finds a problem, a paradox, there emerges thinking. It means, now that there is a paradoxical relationship between cinema and philosophy, or mass and art, philosophy thinks about it. Plato dealt with images because, in his view, images had no relations with ideas. Wherever we find no relationship case, it means we may encounter with philosophical situation. We may perceive why images and rational thinking, or cinema and philosophy, or mass and artistic concepts convey the philosophical situation. Philosophy considers relationships which have no relations, or relations foreign to each other. Images and concepts are foreign to each other. Mass and art are foreign to each other. Therefore, philosophy reflects on cinema. Between them, it has a distance and interval. This is one of the general views on the relationship between cinema and philosophy. You can put cinema on the one hand and place philosophy on the other side, divide them, and claim that there is no relationship between them. But is this really so? I want to discuss this. In my speech, I want to focus on the idea based on the features of media, because I come from media studies and communication studies. That is why I focused on the media, the features of media. But before I do, in order to pass my argument, I want to clarify different approaches to the relationship between cinema and philosophy, because many people who are ordinary people can watch us as well. Not only philosophers, but also people, ordinary people can watch the YouTube channel maybe. We should collect some ideas. So, why philosophers are interested in cinema? The second thing. A philosopher may be interested in cinema for a few reasons. The first one is because of the entertaining aspect of cinema. You know, as Bela Balash claimed, cinema, first of all, has the fundamental capacity of entertaining people. It is a natural feeling for any person to want to be entertained. Even Wittgenstein spent time watching movies. Philosophers need to get rid of the pressures of the rational thinking and logic. The second reason why a philosopher might deal with cinema, I think, comes from cine images. What is their ontological status? Are they a psychological entity or beyond our subjective viewpoint? You know, we know that Bergson and Deleuze discussed the concept of images. There emerge some questions here. What is movement? What is time? Are images real movement or artificial movements? Certain philosophers discuss these issues. In the Republic, you know, Plato as well, with the famous cave allegory, took up the issue of images. We may call this approach the philosophy of film, an approach about the ontic status of cine images. A third reason why a philosopher might care about cinema is because I think she or he wonders about the film experience. This is the key point. Watching a movie is a different experience than reading a book or listening to a musical performance. With movies, we live the experience with orally and verbally. With orally and visually. We are inside the images, cine images while watching. But reading a book requires us to imagine the written medium rather than living the experience as they are. We may call this approach philosophy and cinematic experience. Another reason for a philosopher to deal with cinema is because of the illustrative aspect of movies. What does it mean? In the philosopher's mind, there are some concepts like death, freedom, being, life, reality, happiness, existence, etc. And films illustrate these kinds of concepts. Today, philosophy teachers can benefit from movies or movie scenes in order to teach some philosophical themes to students. A common example is the movie Matrix. You know, what is reality? What is appearance? Reality has attracted many philosophers in the history of philosophy. In the Matrix, in the digital world, humans lived like the slaves of Plato's cave, while machines set up a phenomenal world for humans. This approach can be called film about philosophy, a term for movies that illustrate philosophical ideas. In fact, some movies bring up some philosophical issues in a central and serious way. If a director focuses on philosopher's life or his basic concepts, a film can be about philosophy. Films about the philosopher's life or their views can attract many philosophers. These are philosophical movies, like the Matrix trilogy by Wachowski brothers, A Clockwork Orange by Stanley Kubrick, and Wittgenstein by Derek Jarman. Yeah, although there are some differences between these approaches, they share a similar idea. There is a reference point called philosophy. It means ratio, logic, and concepts come first, and cinema is just instrument for philosophy. Cinema is used to illustrate philosophical themes. Cinema, according to these views, is like a shadow, uh, a phenomenal word of philosophy. Now, I would like to turn my attention to a different approach to cinema. Film as philosophy, or movie-made philosophy, or as I put it, cinephilosophy. What is it? Films can do philosophy with their optic and sonic images or cine images with their own style. I mean, the basic medium of film is not a written or verbal medium. It is a visual medium or cine image. Films can do philosophy with cine images rather than through a written or verbal medium. I call it cinephilosophy. Daniel Frampton defines this approach philosophy, and Thomas Wartenberg and Tal Shamir calls it cinematic philosophy. Whatever we name it, the important thing is that films can do a different philosophy. This is another kind of philosophy. It is a kind of, a movie-made philosophy. This philosophy does not reject written or oral philosophy. It is just a different philosophy. Now, I would like to discuss its basic features. In philosophical discussions, many philosophers and social scientists generally neglect the medium. A medium is a kind of platform or platform on which you can load and transfer your ideas. For example, in order to make my speech and convey my ideas to you, I use an oral platform and a digital platform. Before I made my speech, my ideas were on a paper. The written medium in this example is another medium. Cinema is a different medium, a cinematic medium done with cine images. We should delineate the details of the features of mediums and the relationships between medium and philosophy. Philosophy began with Socratic Dialogues in the ancient Agora in ancient Greece. And Socrates particularly was against the written medium. He believed the written word could not answer all questions. It is a rigid form of media. For him, the written text could not answer all questions. And also the text freezes the poetic and dialogical talk. The written medium, Socrates argued, is impossible to change. And also, the written medium repeats itself when it is read. It is impossible to change the written text. Besides, the text cannot defend itself. Socrates comes to the conclusion that writing has a lower status than dialogue. Dialogue is the best medium for achieving truth. And during the Socratic era, philosophy was done by oral dialogues, and no one claimed whether or not it was a philosophical discussion. As you see, during the Socratic era, the new medium, the written word, was an invention that was used to do philosophy. It was new, and ancient philosophers had been living under an oral tradition. They connected philosophy with oral speech, not the written word. But over time, when they internalized the written word, forms of doing philosophy changed. The practice of writing and reading came first. Socrates had been wrong by not perceiving the potential of the new technology, meaning writing, during his time. Today, I think in our contemporary world, some philosophers are making the same kind of mistake by not seeing the new medium, cine images. Cine images have the potential of the cinematic platform to engage with philosophy. What I want to clarify is that there is no pure platform for creating philosophy. Philosophy was not born with writing. It means philosophy is not objectively and purely connected to writing. Doing philosophy with cine images is a new possibility for engaging with philosophical thinking. There can be different ways of doing philosophy. As you see, written philosophy, oral philosophy, and cine philosophy. There is no hierarchy among them. This is an important point. There is no hierarchy. We can just say that every medium has its own style and is different from the other. If so, I would like to move to another issue, the relationship between film and philosophy. In the beginning of my speech, I mentioned the paradoxical relationship between philosophy and cinema, and also I emphasized that it is wrong to make a distinction between philosophy and cinema. I want to express that cinema is just another way of doing philosophy. Medium is a key term to understand this point. In fact, the new paradox emerged from my discussion about the medium. Accepting that cinema is another way of doing philosophy doesn't mean that using the conjunction and between cinema and philosophy is a mistake. I mean, if we use the expression cinema and philosophy, it means that there is a gap, a distance between cinema and philosophy. In fact, according to my argument, there are different ways of doing philosophy, and cinema cannot be separated from philosophy. At this point, the use of "and" in film and philosophy or cinema and philosophy is unnecessary. Consciously or unconsciously, we are driven by the thought that cinema is not a natural platform for doing philosophy. Many philosophers think that directors produce movies and philosophers reflect on films. Philosophers believe that films just illustrate written philosophical ideas. But if we adopt the cinephilosophy approach, we should understand that it is a mistake to make a separation between cinema and philosophy. We can use cinephilosophy rather than using the film and philosophy dichotomy. After that, we can divide philosophy into three categories: oral philosophy, written philosophy, and cinephilosophy. If we make a comparison with Spinoza's thinking, I think we can reach a better understanding of my argument. Spinoza made a distinction between substance and attributes. There is one substance, and attributes are just manifestations of the substance. Attributes are expressions of the substance. In my discussion, the substance is philosophy or philosophical thinking, and attributes are different media like oral, written, and cine image. Different mediums are extensions of the substance, meaning philosophy. Each medium provides a different and authentic access to philosophy. doing philosophy with a written philosophy, written word, meaning written philosophy, is not superior to philosophy done with cine images, meaning cine philosophy. If we accept this idea, naturally there could be a room for the possibility that films can create a philosophy by themselves. Interestingly, many philosophers don't want to discuss the relationship between oral philosophy and written philosophy. In ancient Greece, as I have mentioned before, Socrates was doing oral philosophy, and Plato, what did Plato do? Plato wrote these dialogues after Socrates. No philosopher has claimed this argument up to this time. I am showing this argument. Written philosophy is an illustration of oral philosophy. The main philosophy is oral philosophy done by Socrates. And I just illustrated Socrates' ideas. I am typewriter representing Socrates' dialogues via the written text. Yes, it is a ridiculous idea to claim that Plato was a typewriter for Socrates' arguments. Every philosopher accepts that Plato stands on his own as a philosophical creator. The relationship between philosophy and cinema can be raised on this basis. It has a variety of mediums. Each of them offers different perspectives, and also they are connected with each other. One platform like cinema cannot replace another platform like writing. Each medium or platform has a crucial linkage with each other. Rather than talking about film and philosophy, I believe we can suggest cinephilosophy, written philosophy, and oral philosophy. Film and philosophy are not separate fields. We can do written philosophy via written medium. We can do oral philosophy via oral speech, or we can do cinephilosophy via cine images. Each medium or platform has limitations and possibilities. Each platform has the potential for engaging with philosophy. Each medium leads to the creation of different different types of philosophical works. It is a contribution to philosophy. Different types of medium presents a variety of possibilities. For example, we can create a rational discussion and use concepts with a written philosophy more easily than cinephilosophy. Why? Because cine images are basically affective. They touch our bodies. We can be affected emotionally and sensually. And also emotion and affection are not totally outside of the rational discussion, rational dimension. David Hume, Spinoza, Nietzsche, Deleuze, and today many neuroscientists emphasize this point. Cine operations like shots, frames, camera angles, camera movement, montage, and lighting reach the audience through heart and senses rather than through the rational mind. Film makes us see the world and experience it. Philosopher directors as Orson Welles, Ingmar Bergman, Akira Kurosawa, Andrei Tarkovsky, Robert Bresson, Alfred Hitchcock, Stanley Kubrick, Jean-Luc Godard, Louis Buñuel know how to create an idea as an experience. In the written text, ideas are abstractions of the mind, but in cine images, ideas are sensations as perceptions of the body. It means cinema can merge an idea with a sensual experience. If we put together our brain and our physical body via different types of philosophical platforms, I believe philosophy can come down from the academic ivory tower to the bazaar, to the agora. I call cinema philosophy of the bazaar as well as art of the bazaar. Everyone who has the abilities to see and hear can reach the philosophy of movies. Therefore, cinema is a democratic platform for doing philosophy. One of the biggest differences between written philosophy and cinephilosophy is based upon the separation between reflection or imagination and experience. To put it simply, written philosophy reflects or imagines the problems or paradoxes, whereas cinephilosophy makes us live the experience as it is. A film has the potential to make us see or experience the thinking in action. The thinking in action. But the written text requires us to imagine or reflect upon the ideas. A film creates this experience with its instruments, like camera movement, camera angles, montage. But the written text is static and stands on the paper by itself. By reading, we imagine the meaning rather than experiencing it. Films show the idea as an event in motion, and text makes us imagine the idea. Experience is a key term here. As Krakauer claimed, in modern life, things are lost. They become invisible. Our pragmatic view, ideological apparatus, science, and technology frames the reality. Heidegger made a distinction between calculative thinking and meditative thinking. Calculative thinking is in connection with the dominance of science and technology in our life. Being slips away from our gaze. How can human faces, animals, plant, and inorganic world be visible? As Bela Balash stated, films let people see human faces, which had been lost since the invention of the printing press. With letters, we just read about the human faces in the books and imagined them. We could not experience the intensity of faces with all the lines on them, but films made human face visible again. Krakauer argued films not only showed human faces, but also other things, including inorganic life. Today's streets, faces, homes, railway stations lie before eyes, but in fact they are invisible to us. Our pragmatic life, customs, habits, scientific and technological gaze make them invisible. So films reveal the abstract life surrounding us. Written philosophy generally works with abstractions and generalizations. This abstract thinking is outside of the agora, where philosophy was born. Films can concrete abstract thinking. And Whitehead said, quote, when you understand all about the atmosphere, when you understand all about the sun and all about the atmosphere, and all about the rotation of the earth, you may still miss the radiance of the sunset. How can we experience the sunset as it is without abstraction? Whitehead claimed art and aesthetic education can give this experience. Krakauer argues cinema can help us to touch the reality, not only fingerprints, but also, shake hands with it. For the first time, cine images made us possible to experience the material life from bottom to top. Other arts and philosophy, written philosophy, proceed from top to bottom. But cinema starts with raw material and helps us to appreciate our given material environment. As Krakauer said, films virtually make the world our home. To make the world our home, to experience our home as it is. This is one of the basic characteristics of cinephilosophy. To end my speech, I would like to sum up my arguments. Philosophy started mainly as an oral tradition in the Greek marketplace, the agora. Then, with the written word, philosophy abandoned its origins and transferred itself to the academic ivory tower. Philosophy became synonymous with writing and later printing, and then they influenced philosophy. Philosophical written and printed texts were thought to be philosophy. What is the price of this? We have paid a very heavy price. Philosophy was alienated from common language, common people, everyday life. In the beginning, philosophy was with young people, everyday people at the bazaar. But now philosophy is alienated from its origins. It became aristocratic thinking. I believe cinephilosophy is a great opportunity to make philosophy accessible once again. Cinephilosophy can make a great contribution to creating new concepts and thoughts in philosophical thinking. Cinephilosophy is a new way of doing philosophy. That is it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Ostruk. Wow, where do I begin? Probably nowhere, because if I begin, I will take somebody else's time. Very inspiring. You covered many issues, many important things. You gave us new, I'll say it, a controversial idea between cinema and philosophy, which is quite new to me. I don't know about someone else, but I really hope that we can discuss these issues that you touched upon in the discussion. So I'm urging everyone to participate in the discussion once this session is over, and to write down the questions on our Facebook page or in the Zoom meeting for those of for the ones that are not actively engaged in this conference. Now we shall head to, excuse me, just to, our next panelist is my dear friend Boško Karadžov, my dear friend and colleague. We both graduated, got our PhDs at the same Faculty of Philosophy and the Institute of Philosophy in Skopje. He's a professor of philosophy, just like me, and he's an independent researcher in the field of graphic literature and intermedia art. Not in Macedonia. Also, he is. It's not mentioned here, but he has, as I know, specialized in epistemology, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. So he will be speaking to us something about cinematic iconography of movement as a model for understanding ontology of graphic literature and comic book art. Just to mention that Boško is one of the most how should I say this, enthusiastic followers of comic art and strip art in Macedonia. So I suppose that his presentation will touch upon the relationship between comics and cinema. Boško, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you for the nice words. The title of my paper is Cinematic Iconography of Movement as a Model for Understanding Ontology of Graphic Literature and Comic Book Art. As you can guess, my field of scientific research interest is the interference between, on the one hand, philosophical and theoretical approach to the film as artistic discipline, and on the other hand, the academic and scientific attempts to understand the aesthetic nature of comic books and graphic literature in general. And exactly because of this, my paper is a kind of cross-disciplinary study of the impact that the knowledge and insights of the film philosophy approach have on the theoretical consideration of graphic literature and comic book art. Probably you already know, for a long time, there was a no theoretical interest in the comic books because of the two very influential culturological positions of two eminent, in those times, eminent scholars in the 50s and in the early 60s. There was a pretty much a dark and difficult days for the comics in the 50s and in the early 60s, especially after the book Seduction of the Innocent by German-American psychiatrist Friedrich Werthmann. The book was published in 1954, and in this book, the comic books was characterized as directly responsible for the growing of juvenile delinquency and the crime in the United States. And also, it was a dark and difficult days for the comics in the 50s and the early 60s, especially after Dwight MacDonald's article, Theory of Mass Culture, in which the comics are accused of being worthless achievements, junk literature, with, how Dwight MacDonald says, homogenizing effects of kitsch, which blurs age lines in the sense of what Dwight MacDonald said, adultizing children and infantile adults. And after this very powerful position, for a long time, the comic books was considered to be shunned phenomenon on pop culture, and additionally not only responsible for nurturing the bad literary taste, but also responsible for moral corruption of the youth. But probably you already know, after the Art Spiegelman, who received a Pulitzer Prize for Literature for his comic book Mouse, after the groundbreaking series in mainstream comic books, which begin to talk about some political and social issues of those times very seriously, after the masterpieces of Franco-Belgian School of Comics, after the masterpieces of Italian, of Spanish, of Japanese School of Comics, after the British invasion in the 80s and the iconic influence of Alan Moore, Neil Gaiman, Grant Morrison, David Lloyd, V for Vendetta, and everything which comes with British invasion in comics. After the raising of human rights, women's rights issue in Islamic culture through the graphic novels Persepolis and Embaudoris by this magnificent artist Marjane Satrapi. After the Joe Sacco and his civic comic book journalism from the military hotspots around the world. And we now overcome these long-standing stereotypes, and academic, cultural, and professional public now was convinced in the undeniable value and aesthetic legitimacy of comic books. And however, this overcoming has opened up space for research on the complex form of ideological power and the complex form of political reflection that the comics as phenomenon of pop culture brings in itself. But it also opened up the possibility of exploring the media ontology of graphic literature and aesthetic nature of comic book art. And what happens? Film as an art, historically speaking, first went through the process of legitimization and justification of the claim that film deserves to be considered as independent art form. This process of aesthetical legitimization and philosophical justification also requires some kind of epistemological and ontological research of the structure of the film, essential structure of the film. And during this period, while graphic literature fight for their aesthetic recognition, the film as the art and his subsequent theoretical and philosophical reflection of its technical nature and media characteristic already had built and established. And we, for example, we already have established Hugo Münsterberg narrative technical devices that distinguished film from the theater as art form. We already have established Rudolf Arnheim idea of film's ability to represent moving bodies. We already have established André Bazin focus on the image that emphasizes reality. We already established the transparency thesis and the classic theory of philosophy and film, which understand film as a process of invention and arrangements with visual imagery. And we have already established this motion pictures, this cinematographia to write some kind of artistic experience with moving pictures. And because of this, and that's why this established approach to the philosophy of film strongly influenced to the philosophy of graphic literature. What I want to say, in other words, based on this aesthetic authenticity, which was earlier of the film as the most complex form of artistic creation, we can witness within the theoretical study of graphic literature and comic book art certain and dominant cross-disciplinary theoretical and philosophical views that defines graphic literature and comic book art through the prism of the cognitive, sensomotoral, visual, and technical aspect of the film as art. And we can call this philosophical approach that use film as a model for understanding media ontology of graphic literature, we can call this cinematic theory of comics. And this theory starts from the interpretation that comic books and graphic novels are cinematic phenomena. Why? Because the pictorial and fabular elements in the comics are structured in the framed, juxtaposed, narrative, proto-cinematic, deliberate sequence. And that's why one of the first books, theoretical books, Will Eisner write comics and sequential art. According to this approach, to this cinematic theory of comics, comics are part of what we can call in general term sequential art. But in addition, this theory, this cinematic theory of comics, consider every comic and every graphic novel to be objectified ontology of movement. What that means, in other words, that means that the being of the comic book art was born when we had reification of the first pictorial attempt to express the movement. In one of the rare theoretical books here in Macedonia, the author Tomislav Osmali says that the movement in comics are not ontologically present. It is the movement is ontological property of the comics only as aspiration. Every comics wants to become a movie or film of cinema. And this is the very big problem. Why? Because predicated on this, the final consequence of this determination of comic book as an iconography of dynamism is that comic books and movies have the same structural essence in attempt to represent the movement, but only with a small remark that in the film and in the animation. Also, this type of representation is optically fused and mingled, since the interpretation of comics as optically detached and fractioned kinematography considers comic books as a part of this cinematic experience with moving images. And however, we believe that this interpretation of ontology without ontology is very problematic and very difficult to accept for the number of reasons. That's the point of my paper, because this interpretation does not recognize the elements that constitutes what I called the comic book logic of sensation. And more precisely, we consider that this cinematic theory of comics are not adequately explaining the media ontology of graphic literature and aesthetic nature of comic book art. But furthermore, this cinematic paradigm of defined comics does not at all legitimize comics as a separate, autonomous, independent artistic discipline. If the difference, this is the major, this is the small argument, if the difference between the comic book and films is only in this optical fused or optical detached representation of the movement, then comic books are nothing but some sort of unfinished or imperfect film, some sort of unrealized film, some sort of semi-films without optical cohesion, something not yet ecranized film, or some type of storyboards. In other words, one kind of Edward Muybridge chronophotography, if you remember that kind of artistic experimentation of Edward Muybridge. And precisely because of this implication, we will review and analyze another theoretical perspective and another philosophical approach. We don't think that this ontological essence of comic books is in this, how I can call a chronotopic optical detachment. No, the graphic novels or comic books are on the creative border, ontologically speaking, between painting and literature. And they takes from the literature methodical articulation of storytelling and temporalic pictorial narratives and other narrative strategy. And also, graphic literature takes from the painting the possibility of visual concretization of each individual detail of the story and possibility for independent artistic and figural exposition of the moment. In the term of discovering this, what I try to find autonomous media ontology of graphic literature and aesthetic nature of comic book art, one of the key meta-comical achievement, one of the key theoretical book which was written and painted as meta-comics is the great book by one master study American comic book artist and theorist Scott McCloud. The name of the book is Understanding Comics, The Invisible Art. The book was published in 1993. What Gilles Deleuze books, Cinema 1, the movement image, and Cinema 2, the time image, represent and means for philosophy of film, is the same for Scott McCloud and his book Understanding Comics, The Invisible Art. What Gilles Deleuze represent, like a groundbreaking theory for the philosophy of film, is the same for Scott McCloud in the philosophy of comics. In the short, we don't have too much time to elaborate his ontology of comic books. In the short, in the interest of time, normally, Scott McCloud explains that ontology of comic books is indicated by its two essential features. He called them call and response, and comic book time. An essential aesthetic features of comics is this balance between visible and invisible in it. This balance operates on the basis of the aesthetic principle that Scott McCloud called call and response, which is kind of a reader experience, some kind of receptive aesthetical experience. Concretely and specifically, the comic book author allows us to visualize a certain act within the illustrated panels. That's the call. But also leaves us an empty space between the panels, so-called gather, to imagine the composition of events for ourselves. This is the reader response. Call, response, call, response. The comic book has its own aesthetic modus operandi. Call, response, reading experience is realized in these two key receptive and cognitive acts and possibilities. A, the visual experience or experience from the impressionistic pictorial stimulus from the painted part. This is the call when we read. But B, the possibility for imagining which was provided by the empty receptive space between two panels, the gutter, which allows us to have response with our imagination. What is the main point here? In other narrative forms, such as literature and films, this principle is partly absent. Literature does not have the pictorial stimulus, but has the receptive opportunity for active and cognitive representation and imagination of the content and action. While in film, in animation, there is no significant imaginative freedom and possibility of different and personal imagining, because the visual stimulations is completely given, predetermined, and pictorially defined by the author of the film and animation. Films makes use of audience imagination for occasional effects, not like the comics with essentially and constantly. And what is the major point here? There is no significant ontological possibility of the film for a different pictorial experience from the outer visual solution. And also there is no significant ontological possibility of the literature for artistic and figurative incentives and visual stimulation for imagination and representation. But comics and graphic literature had these two things that film and literature lack. Why? Because comic books and graphic literature, ontologically and epistemologically speaking, has possibility for pictorial stimulation and possibility for active and cognitive imagination. And this autonomous media ontology of graphic literature and aesthetic nature of comic books art is exactly in what happened like an experience. What happens in the reading process is one experience that is called to be closure. What is closure? Closure is a reader's role in closing these narrative gaps, the gutters between the comic book panels. And since the being of the comic books is not born when we have the first attempt to express the movement, the being, the essence, the ontology of comic books is born in this a cognitive phenomenon that we can call, and Scott McCloud also called, the closure. What is the closure? Closure is cognitive and epistemological phenomenon. It means observing the parts, but perceiving the whole. Observing the parts, but perceiving the whole in films. The closure takes place continuously in what we can call persistence of vision. It's automatic closure. We have automatic closures in film. But in the comics, use of closure is like no other artistic discipline. In comics, audience is willing and consciousness collaborator through this role of closing narrative gaps, which gather give us opportunity, gather the empty space between the comic book panels. And this empty space, this nothingness, this gutter between the panel makes us possibility with the reading comic book experience that human imagination takes two separate images and transforms them into the single idea. This nothingness, this empty space, this gutter between the panels and its cognitive function are the ontological essence of comic book art. And I will conclude with one or two sentences. Comics and graphic novels are part of multimodality and visual rhetoric, like a sophisticated text and complex literacy. Comics and graphic novels use several semiotical modes for designing its semiotical products. Relationship between image and text is mutually constitutive, mutually infused. In other words, comics and graphic novels are fusion of image and words, like a double vision of literacy. Even we have a new term for this, image word, or in our Slavic languages, slikozba. And the final sentence in one recent book I strongly recommend by this neuroscientific and cognitive researcher in the United States. It's called Neil Quen. He's published his book, The Visual Language of Comics, Introduction of the Structure and Cognition of Sequential Images. The book was published in 2013. We can find psychological experimentation that suggests similarities between the way that our brain perceives language and the similarities between how our brain perceives the sequential images. And that's why iconography of comic book languages and its authentic multimodal literacy are subset of much more general human perceptual and cognitive activity, which includes the reading of picture in the sense of this Deleuzian distinction, thinking with concept and thinking with images, something that is compatible with Professor Serdar speaking before me. This line of interpretation is profound. Thank you very much. This is all the elements that I want to bring and to mention. Thanks.
Thank you, Boško. Wow, reading pictures, viewing words, right? Okay, that was, and the idea of nothingness in between the frames of the comic books and graphic novels. I think that will inspire many people to discuss. I know I have some notes here, but we should go to our next panelist. It's Stanislav Liguzhinsky. I hope I pronounced it right.
Yeah.
He's a PhD candidate in the Jagiellonian University. I hope I pronounced that right, also in Poland. research fellow, essay film lab, Lodge Film School in Poland, research advisor, research in the in and through cinema master program, and he's currently based in the Netherlands, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, you have 20 minutes for your presentation, and you may start.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm actually very glad that I'm coming after Boško because understanding comics was a huge source of inspiration for my work and for my academic journey. And actually, all these affiliations have a lot to do with, what route I've covered actually, and where I have arrived at this very point. And I'm also very glad that that Professor Osturk's talk was just before mine as well, because as much as what Professor Osturk presented as this idea of cinephilosophy, for me is a function of, let's say, a spectatorship, and what philosophy or cinephilosophy can be in relation to the images from the positions of the spectator, then what I'm in particular interested in is what it can give as a function of a cinephilia, but cinephilia understood as this kind of erotics of art that Susan Sontag called for in her famous essay Against Interpretation, as this point where you can't keep your hands away from the object of your study and you need to touch it and you need to start playing with it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Let me share the screen. As I said, like my research, I'm sorry, I just lost. Can everybody still hear me? Because I just lost the.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, perfect. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
The whole Zoom window just disappeared. My background is in film studies and comparative culture studies, and basically how I ventured on this whole journey with video essay as a mode of performing, let's say, philosophy or more like research in film, was coming out of a frustration and maybe certain envy towards our colleagues in literary studies who could directly quote from the texts that they were theorizing about. And that goes back to the sentiment that was already formulated in 1975 by Raymond Bellour in his text, Unattainable Text, where he basically claimed also that the true theory of film can actually emerge where the film can become quotable. And we can actually create this indexical relationship in our theoretical text on film with the film itself, and we can just point to the devices that the film uses when explaining and theorizing about them. And in my case, it happened that I was writing a thesis on Bruno Dumont and his cinema, which is very tactile, very haptic. And in that respect, I was missing some of those devices when describing the methods that he's employing in his cinema. And I was either venturing into this very poetic mode of description or to something so theoretical and detached from the film itself that it was becoming quite frustrating. And this is when I actually started to experiment a little bit with different modes of publication in the very beginning. So I was trying to venture into this world of essay film or video essay as a certain mode of presentation. So how can I actually incorporate moving images in the text that I am producing on cinema? And one thing that it's very quickly brought up, because of course I was using all these blog forms as this very early video essayistic practices were employing, that whenever I was using film quotes, they ended up being very, used up in a very illustrative manner. So I was writing my argument, and then whenever those texts appeared, they were basically just being viewed as symptoms of something that I was already trying to point to in my text. And I was trying to deal with that by making the forms that were purely audiovisual, so basically video essays as such, and using editing as a kind of a form of a constructing of an argument. But what I very quickly realized is that I've been trying to construct those forms in the same way I was writing my written papers. So basically trying to translate, and someone before said about film philosophy being scorned as just bad philosophy, because of course images don't have the same affordances as words. And one thing that we lose is the clarity, for example, that the concepts have. And I very quickly discovered that this mode of translation of certain mode of reasoning into the moving images was actually not very sustainable and not very effective, because I was not doing justice to, let's say, the conceptual mode of thinking, and then I was not using the resources that this new medium was offering me. And this is when I decided to take a short leave out of my academic pathway and go to film school and try to actually learn what affordances does cinema have, and what can I gain from actually engaging those cinema making tools in my own practice. And this is pretty much the time when this whole, let's say, world of cinema or like video essay emerged. So we're talking 2005, 2006, when YouTube and all the streaming services appeared. And this is when those new forms of publishing started emerging. And when they did, they very quickly took this notion of essay or video essay as, let's say, this umbrella term that was describing this whole new movement. And I was at the very beginning quite, let's say, frustrated with it. And there was a lot of criticism directed at it, because essay was understood very much in this very beginnings of that movement as a genre. As a kind of an equivalence of, as we can see here in this Wikipedia definition, a short piece of writing on a particular subject. So, you know, what we kind of associate as a written assignment, you know, at school or university. So just a statement on the subject. But what this word essay actually held in it was also this etymological root, which goes back to an attempt or an effort. Which in the end became much more interesting and inspiring to me. And I very quickly drifted from this idea of understanding essay as a genre to understanding essay as a method or as a certain mode of engagement with the material. And here we have actually a whole array of definitions of essay, from the ones that are quite classical and they pertain to genre. So an essay is a piece of writing that gives an author's own argument, but the definition is vague. To the definition of essay that actually comes from Michel de Montaigne, who said that for a lack of natural memory, he makes one of paper. And then another one that comes from Georgi Lukács, who calls the essays thoughts occasioned by. And what was interesting to me in particular about this formulation of essay is that it was understood as a certain mode of research, as a certain mode of engaging with the object of description, which basically was relying on a medium of that research. So basically when we write about a certain object, and this were actually statements that were made about the written essay, we use the paper and we use the process of writing to actually formulate the thoughts. So it's not really about the artwork, it's about the work of art. So it's about the process of actually creating that reflection on those objects. Something that Max Benz, I think, very well formulated here in that little quote. So the essayist is a combiner, a tireless producer of configurations around a specific object. Configuration is an epistemological arrangement which cannot be achieved through axiomatic deduction, but only through a literary ars combinatoria in which imagination replaces strict knowledge. Like the configuration of fragments in a kaleidoscope or cinematic montage, the essay offers for Bense a creative rearrangement and play of an idea and an image. I mean, what is interesting about this formulation, and of course a lot of previous speakers were talking about the philosophy and trying to actually claim the film for philosophy and being concerned with those disciplinary divisions. What I very quickly understood making that move towards filmmaking in my practice was that we need to actually broaden a little bit the scope of what we consider knowledge or acceptable knowledge that is produced in this through this practice. And I think what this Bence's quote points into, that it becomes this ars combinatoria, something that is basically a function of play, is aligned with Giorgio Agamben's idea of profanation. So you take something that was an object of study, an object of viewing, and you restore it to free use. So basically you start taking this object apart, collaging it with different elements, and basically to a certain degree destroying it in the process, but maybe gaining something through that practice as well. So as I said before, this is actually where I think with using Barbara Bolt's idea, what becomes the scope of this practice is not the work of art anymore, but not the artwork, but the work of art itself. And there is this quote from Theodor Adorno, that was always quite mysterious to me before making all those discoveries. Hence, the essay's innermost formal law is heresy. Through violations of the orthodoxy of thought, something in the object becomes visible, which it is orthodoxy's secret and objective aim to keep invisible. And what I find very liberating about embracing this form of essay is that you get all these elements that are available to art, this, let's say, poetic elements that are available to art at your disposal to actually create thought and create certain thought processes. What it reminds me of is actually this poem by Wallace Stevens, Man Carrying a Thing. And it starts with this line: the poem must resist the intelligence almost successfully. Illustration: a broom figure in winter evening resists identity. The thing he carries resists the most necessitous sense. Accept them then as secondary. Parts not quite perceived of the obvious whole, uncertain particles of the certain solid. The primary free from doubt. Things floating like the first hundreds flakes of snow. Out of a storm we must endure all night. Out of a storm of secondary things, a horror of thoughts that suddenly are real, we must endure our thoughts all night until the bright obvious stands motionless in cold. I mean, what is interesting to me, of course, there is this poetic device here being used, where basically the view of the object at hand is being obscured. So the title of the poem is Man Carrying a Thing, and we could just have literally a man carrying a thing. But what we do through poiesis, through the work of poetry, is we obscure the view and we delay the comprehension. And basically we expand the duration of the perception or of the process of perceiving itself. And this is something that Wiktor Szkowski branded as either the estrangement or defamiliarization in his famous book, Art as a Device. And what he says there is the goal of art is to create the sensation of seeing and not merely recognizing things. The device of art is estrangement of things and the complication of the form, which increases the duration and complexity of perception, as the process of perception is, in art, an end in itself and must be prolonged. Art is the means to live through the making of a thing. What has been made does not matter in art. And here is another statement on that ostranenie, as it comes from Russian. According to Szkowski, only displaced objects truly reach us. Art is the knowledge of how to displace things. And ostranenie being the process of encouraging people to see common things as strange, wild, or unfamiliar, defamiliarizing what is known in order to know it differently or more deeply. And if we think about the cinema as a device and like specific devices that cinema offers in order to achieve that, there's of course plenty, but maybe the most immediate ones that comes to mind, and here is for comedy relief, is
a MacGuffin you see in most films about spies. It is a thing that the spies are after. In the days of Rudyard Kipling, it would be the plans of the fort on the Khyber Pass. It would be the plans of an airplane engine. and the plans of an atom bomb, anything you like. It's always called the thing that the characters on the screen worry about, but the audience don't care. And someone asked, what is a MacGuffin? And it's described in a scene in an English train going to Scotland. And one man says to the other opposite him, he said, what's that package above your head there? And the other man said, oh, that's a MacGuffin. He said, what is a MacGuffin? He said, well, it's an apparatus for trapping lions in the Scottish Highlands. The man said, but there are no lions in the Scottish Highlands. He said, then that's no MacGuffin. A MacGuffin.
So MacGuffin is essentially this device that is created in the drama and dramaturgy, but it doesn't really matter what it is. It's actually just a mystified device that everybody's desiring, and that basically creates this whole suspense and desire in the plot that makes it move, and let's say this desire of thought in order to be solved. The famous example of MacGuffin that I like in particularly is the one from the movie Avatar, where there's actually a resource there that is called unobtainium. So by its very name, it's actually branded as something that cannot be obtained. And for me, the essay is actually the art of making the object at hand a MacGuffin. So something that is being mystified through our play and through this elements of play and how we engage with it. So if we, after Szkowski, actually treat this work of art as a certain device, there's an interesting takes of how we can understand devices or machines. That comes from Benoit Turquetti, this book, Machines, Gestures, and Media History, where he says that archaeology proceeds from the machines to a general history. It takes up the devices as archives of the gestures, operations, and conceptions they objectify. The structure, form, and logic of the machines are the materialization of the operative series that produced them, while also bearing witness to the gestures they replaced or took part in. The machine traces the organized series of gestures that make up the way it is handled, according to which it was conceived and which in part it determines in the return. So basically the machine in its materiality, it actually is the problem that begs to be solved, and it offers certain affordances. And here is actually the video that I like in particular because it looks like Bob Ross explaining.
Affordances is a technical term, sometimes hard to get, but it's really quite simple. Affordances refers to the properties of an object and the person. It's the relationship between the object and the person and what the person can do with that object. For example, what is this? Peculiar shape, peculiar object, but it has practical affordances. For example, it affords support. It's a chair, see? Very comfortable chair. In fact, as long as it supports me and is about the right size, I could use it to stand on. Rolls a bit, but it affords support, affords standing. In fact, it affords lifting, and therefore throwing. I could throw it at you. And hiding, see? It does not afford the passage of light. Therefore, it makes me invisible, useful to hide against. Lots of affordances.
That's enough to convey the idea. Why I find it necessary to bring the notions of affordances is because what I propose through the essay and the engagement that the essay, film for me, or video essay allows in relation to the film object is a different type of epistemology that is based more on the paradigm of touching, with what Katrin Grant calls touching the film object, rather than observing. And this is actually a quote from Willem Flusser, who suggests this gesture of making, which is basically a gesture of research or the mode of researching objects or objects. So what he says here is that the gesture of making has a complexity that defies description. But for didactic purposes, the gesture can be divided into simple phases. Simplified in this way, the gesture of making may be described something like this. Both hands reach out towards the world of objects. They grasp an object, they tear it from its environment, they press on the object from two sides. They change its form. The words we use to describe this movement of our hands, take, grasp, get hold, handle, bring forth, produce, have become abstract concepts, and we often forget that the meaning of these concepts was abstracted from the concrete movements of our hands. That lets us see to what extent our thinking is shaped by our hands, by way of the gesture of making and by the pressure the two hands exert on the objects to meet. And it's very interesting. Here is the excerpt of Catherine Grant's video of touching the film object, where she describes what haptic criticism means. And I think what is very interesting in this, let's say, proposal of building the epistemology based on gesture is the fact that there is a feedback loop. So anytime we actually touch something, it pushes us back. So the way we, with the editing or with other filmmaking tools, that we try to gain access to that object that already has embedded certain affordances that were traces of those events that were made during its production, that we can actually try to feel out what those affordances embedded in that material objects were. Just a second. Okay, and as a kind of a final example of this approach, I singled out the Xian Huang's work, The Inheritance, which I think is a great example of this gesture of research that is delineated by Willem Flusser, and shows actually all the stages of, let's say, such an essayistic approach, which doesn't necessarily cover or says it all about the object, but can reveal something interesting about its features. And it's actually quite figurative in the way it does it.
戒严时代，我们其实是不被允许去探索我们自己的过去。我觉得真正的自由，应该是每一个人有能力去回溯与记录他自己本身私人的历史。
I'm just going to skip a little bit.
上一代曾经用自己的肉体去抚平这些锐利与坚硬的制度，我觉得这应该是我们上一代给我们最伟大的遗产。但是这些精神上的遗产却没有在公版历史上留下任何的记录。我只能够用摸索去了解我自己的私人的历史。我想要用我自己的手与脚去感受这样子的一个过程，与凭吊那个时代。这是一个缓慢与私密的测量，用自己的身体缓缓抚摸过去的历史，使用动作捕捉与3D列印技术， 将我手的轨迹转化为可以捧在怀里触摸的雕塑。戒严时代，我们其实是
So what he does here is basically he uses motion capture suits, and basically by touching these objects of his studies, he creates those maps that are actually records of his, let's say, engagement with those objects. The same way that for me, the essay is basically a record of the process of thinking around the object of the study. And then what is interesting, of course, is that through that process, he creates a new object, which is, for me, a new thought that emerges in this engagement between the thought and the object of thinking. And this is where I come back to this point that I was making, that the artwork actually here is not the object of study, but it becomes the device that basically lends us the means of studying something. And just to conclude, I wanted to bring forward this quote again from Willem Flusser, where he says, "It does not follow that researching is just function of practice. On the contrary, researching is an effort to make the internal theory of the object coincide with the practice. The gesture of researching is less free than the gesture of comprehending. It is a gesture that is constantly thwarted by objective resistance, constantly deflected from its intended course. As a result, researching is less objective than comprehending. However, in gestures of researching, the object shows itself to be more meaningful. To research, one must make something, and that implies a theory and a practice. We cannot grasp this by treating objects mechanically without theory, or by researching them using pure theory disengaged from the work. Neither a factory worker separated from his theoretical hand by the division of labor, nor a pure theoretician, his practical hand amputated, will research his object. That is alienation." And that is something I would like to conclude with. Thank you.
Thank you, Stanislav. That was an inspiring lecture. I can relate to it, but we must go on because the time is against us. Next, we have Slava Yanakieva, works at the Department of History and Theory of Culture in the University St. Clement Ohridsky in Sofia, also at the Institute of Medieval Philosophy and Culture in Bulgaria. Her paper is titled Medieval Literary and Visual Themes in European Cinematography, Modes of Appearance. Ms. Yanakieva, you may begin. You are muted. Okay.
Could you see the PowerPoint file?
Yep. Yes,
okay.
We can see it. And please also, before you begin, please stick to our schedule of 20 minutes. Thank you.
My research field, as it is obvious, is connected rather to theology and cinema than to philosophy and cinema. But then I assume we can accept the lady or the lord where the maid is readily accepted. That's a joke, of course. This is a debate, quite interesting connection between philosophy and theology. What I will present here is a project, for long time research, and it is about medieval genres and their connection and their representation by cinematography.
So it's not an ordinary paper or presentation. The interest in pre-modern genres has been for a very long time a reserved academic field for classicists and literary historians. Until the end of the 60s, it has been also heavily burdened with evolutionism in its most primitive forms. Ancient and medieval genres were seen either as religious rituals, thus automatically referred to the sphere of anthropology, or as undeveloped forms, sort of nuclei, as it were, of their modern genealogical successors. Since then, things have changed dramatically. A lot of important works appeared that gradually changed the old scientific paradigms and opened a vast field of yet unexplored pre-modern phenomena. The teleological view in literary criticism was largely, if not totally, abandoned, and now normal science goes its way. This is clearly visible in current research on ancient and medieval representational arts. And although such key old generation researchers as A.W. Pickard Cambridge in classics and E.K. Chambers in medieval studies have never been fully neglected, they were nevertheless given their rightful retiring place in history. A mile ahead of the textbooks, the scholarly community is now well aware of how little Sophocles or Euripides have in common with Shakespeare, let alone Beckett or Pinter. This being negotiated, it became crucial for the pre-modern genres, such as drama, to be differentiated and distinguished from the modern species. In the progress, a lot of work was done in the bordering field of anthropology and of art and archaeology. Major works as Oliver Tapley's Greek Tragedy in Action, 1978, and Eckhard Simon's The Theatre of Medieval Europe, New Research in Early Drama, appeared and established the trend in their disciplines. Pre-modern media in modern contexts. While the authentic themes of the ancient theatre were irreparably lost for modern European sensuality, medieval stage and literary genres never really disappeared. The latter were severely persecuted during the Reformation expansion, especially in Britain. They went out of fashion in the times of classicism and were again revitalized by late Romanticism. Medieval presentations, being closely connected with religious and ethnographical rituals, were thus preserved and saw a real renaissance in the end of the 19th and the first two-thirds of 20th century. Renewed interest in academic exploration of surviving medieval manuscripts containing until then unknown dramatic texts went parallel with the purely theatrical interest in recovery of medieval drama. This resulted in the restoration of the annual yearly presentation of biblical cycles such as the York and the Chester plays in the United Kingdom, as well as the popularization of the decadal spectacle of the Oberammergau plays in Bavaria, and so on. Modern media in terms of pre-modern. Apart from being the time of renewed interest towards the pre-modern stage, the end of the 19th century saw also the birth of what proved to be a new visual art, the cinematograph. It is now widely accepted that in its first years, the cinema was largely seen as a mere curiosity. Nevertheless, its first steps were, incidentally or not, connected with pre-modern visual cultures and its genres. Here is probably the place to be reminded that pre-modern genres are limited by rigorous formal characteristics with no valid parallels in modern art. It is the inconceivable union between a newborn out of the technological revolution art and the old rigid genre forms that is so intriguing and deserves exploration. Far from being interchangeable, the terms religious and the pre-modern are nevertheless closely connected to one another. Pre-modern realities are often inseparable from or even identical to religious themes. Religious mentality, on its part, often seeks to express itself in the language of pre-modern culture. That is why the ignorance of the formal side of pre-modern generic elements could easily mislead contemporary secular critics to overinterpret or underinterpret religious matter in the movies. Remarkably, pre-modern religious themes were abundant in the early history of cinema. They took significant place also in masterpieces like Dreyer's The Passion of Joan d'Arc, based on the authentic material of the Inquisition's trial records, and Abel Gance's The End of the World, the first talking picture shot in France. Pre-modern themes attracted the attention of such masters of auteur cinema as Roberto Rossellini, Pier Paolo Pasolini, Robert Bresson, Eric Romer, and are still in the focus of the filmmaker's interest, as one could easily note from the list of the latest European Grand Prix nominees. Following the media battle around the Mel Gibson's Passion, there appeared a number of works treating biblical questions in one way or another. Let me just mention Calvary, 2014, a seemingly straightforward criminal story, which turns out to be a visual allusion to the passions of Christ. And then there is Ida, 2013, a modern story of a girl seeking to find meaning through monasticism, and also the German film Kreuzberg, 2014, which is following the life of a pious girl and her radical Catholic family through the stations of the cross tragically resulting in a dubious wonder. 2011 saw an abundance of end-of-the-world pictures, some of which adventurously spectacular, others, as Malik's Tree of Life, profoundly existentialist and explicitly eschatological. Not unlike the researchers of the medieval stage, religious cinema theorists too had to establish their field as an academic and a deserving one. They too gradually invented their scientific genealogy, although they were deprived from the luxury of slow maturing. Religious and biblical themes were important for the pioneers of cinema critics such as André Bazin and Amédée Effre, but from the 90s on, religious cinema developed its own school of thought. Let us just mention Christopher Deasy, Guy William Ortiz, and Clive Marsh, whose names and works are now well known in academic field. The problem. In a line, one significant problem arises at this point. What exactly is religious cinema? How is it to be evaluated? Some of the critics focus on the instructional aspect of media, thus minimizing its value as autonomous art. Let me mention just a couple of names. Ivan Butler, Religion in the Cinema, 1969, and Harold Charles Gardner, Movies, Morals, and Art, 1961. Others like Lloyd Bow, Imaging the Divine Jesus and Christ Figures in Film, 1997, tried to define a genre frame for cinema based on earlier literary experience, that of literary critics like Detweiler, Bowman, and Tsiolkovsky. There are also those who find exact biblical correspondence of given cinematic works. And lastly, there are attempts at constructing non-confessional criteria of transcendental art. Here I ought to mention Paul Schrader's famous transcendental style in film, also Bresson Dreyer, 1972. It was mentioned earlier by colleagues. The very fact that religious visuality, including medieval film critics, has its own long and fruitful history through which it persistently carried its rigorous genres rules, rarely attracts the attention of investigators. The explanation for this might be that normal science has as its fallback the segmentation of theoretical areas, and sometimes even a loss of the broad picture. Researchers of pre-modern genres are rarely educated in film history, while film theorists could only incidentally be acquainted with pre-modern genres. In view of this contrast, my prospective work aims at finding and defining the remnants of pre-modern genres in works of cinema, as well as discerning the modes of translation of pre-modern genre forms into a modern visuality. Here is a picture from Parsifal, Eric Romer's Parsifal Le Gaulois. Methodology and study stages. The first step towards the accomplishment of this task is the brief examination of medieval visual, literary, as well as liturgical genres and their subgenres. A succinct review of the specific genres of the medieval passions, mysteries, moral allegories, biblical cycles, literary chivalric romances, together with typical iconography, liturgical observances, and hagiographical works will be made so that I heard the message that the recording has stopped.
Yes, apparently it has. Anna, what seems to be the problem?
I haven't done anything.
No, I know. I'm just asking Anna.
Probably a recording doesn't continue recording of the sessions.
I think Anna dropped out, and that's the reason why it's not recording.
Yes, I suppose so. Okay, never mind. Go on. Continue.
So all these works and genres ought to provide a sufficient frame of reference. Secondly, an attempt towards an indexation of the diversity of film. Secondly, an attempt towards an indexation of diversity of film concerning medieval or relevant pre-modern phenomena will be made according to the modes of employment of pre-modern genre forms. A film treating the final part of Christ's story, for example, will be analyzed through the lens of the passion play genre, iconographical and liturgical elements, as well as the emphatically anti-canonical representations, as in Pasolini's Passion and elsewhere, will be considered in order to define the limits of pre-modern influence. More or less the same procedure will be followed in the work on the miracle films, which may have a connection, direct or not, to hagiographical literature and biblical content, or even to pre-modern oral tradition. The translation of wonder presentations into the cinema language will be considered and systematized, for example, in Rossellini's Paisa and Stromboli, in terms of dramaturgy. A genealogy of cinema as par excellence wonder-working media will be traced back to pioneers such as Georges Méliès. Although broadly employed in the time of the great cinematic auteurs some 50 years ago, medieval iconography, with its more or less strict rules and modes of expression, is now almost impenetrable to popular modern visual habits and frame of thought. Such iconographical content or mere references could presently be seen almost exclusively in examples of the independent art cinema. Exceptions make popular directors as Kim Ki-duk and M. Night Shyamalan, who play with European traditional topics while at the same time being culturally distanced, estranged from them. The above-mentioned inscrutability of pre-modern examples, both literally and visual, doesn't prevent elitist comedies such as those of Monty Python and, to a less extent, Mario Monicelli's Crusade comedies from being popular even nowadays. Much like the cartoons of Asterix, they seem to provoke their contemporary public to become acquainted with the classical content employed. Thirdly, hagiographical pictures, or hagiopics, if we may borrow a freshly minted by Pamela Gray's term, present a totally different set of problems. A film of a saint more often than not coincides with the plot of his or her legend. Its treatment of the legendary matter, the degree of estrangement from the source or the literary medium, the cinematic translation of the hagiographical genre frame, cover only partially the broad research area. Two saintly heroes have proved to be particularly appealing to film art, Joan of Arc and Francesco of Assisi. The immediate availability of textual evidence of their lives make the examination of the use of pre-modern forms in these two cases especially promising. An excellent example in these terms is Rossellini's Little Flowers of San Francesco. The film is segmented not unlike the anecdotal structure of its hagiographical sources. Even the engagement of Franciscan novices for the roles of the Brotherhood contributes to the feeling of authenticity of the presented matter. On the other hand, there are Liliana Cavani's two pictures of the life of the saint that focus in span of 30 years on problems only peripheral to the religious matter. And for, let me see. Another important theme is the chivalric literature and its modes of representation. The abundance of cinematic examples here would be limited by the fact that the medieval plot of most of the popular night movies only appears a plausible excuse for inventing adventurous situations. Therefore, my work will be centered exclusively on films which might be useful in terms of pre-modern genre forms. Masterpieces such as Lancelot Dulac, 1974, Robert Bresson and Romers Perceval Le Gaulois, 1978, Pupier Bacchus Magnificat, 1993, are especially susceptible to such a research. The Crusade comedies of Monty Python and Mario Monicelli, Brancaleone's Army, or as it is known in the English-speaking world, For Love and Gold, 1966, Brancaleone at the Crusades, 1970, have their own specific importance. Let us take, for example, Monty Python's comical use of a cartoon medieval manuscriptural aesthetics in the Holy Grail, 1975, and Jabberwocky, 1977. It could be formally opposed to Eric Romer's illumination-like set design and choreography in Percival. Another interesting point of comparison between Percival and the Holy Grail could be the traditional nice trial as basic element of the quest. While Percival silently observed the procession of the Holy Grail and do nothing to help the Fisher King, King Arthur's knights in the Monty Python's film answer the senseless question of the keeper of the bridge of death in an even more stupid way in order to pass the bridge. And again, Percival Le Gaulois, 1978, is valuable for our task in more than one way. The authentic mode of musical presentation on historical instruments and emphatically rigid iconic gestures of the musicians in Romer's film are complemented by a pantomimic medieval crucifixion play. Similar examples of direct inclusion of pre-modern stage art in cinema will be examined. The direct inclusion in contemporary cinema of pre-modern genre forms as passion plays poses the question of their functionality in such an alien milieu as the modern art of cinema. Cinematic modernity, for that matter, is by no means uniform, and this could be easily seen in works as different as Romer's Percival, where we have a crucifixion play, Pasolini Ricotta, which is a film about filming of a crucifixion play, Jesus of Montreal, with its general plot line about staging of a passion play, and Ivan the Terrible, the second film, in which is incorporated the prophet play of the three youths in the furnace. Second, conclusions and expected outcomes. In view of the abundance of the research material, a selection of historically valuable and critically acclaimed cinematic works will be made. A thorough investigation of the themes would require a more extensive working process, as well as easy access to both visual and textual resources. Nevertheless, a groundwork as the proposed here may become, if successfully accomplished, an invitation for a long-awaited academic debate, which may clear the ambiguities of contemporary cinema critics in the field explored. Upon successful completion, this work may fill a void not only in Bulgarian but also in European media studies as planned, and this will result in a publication of a longer separate study in a specialized journal, multimedia disc, and extra monographical studies. I would like to show you, I don't know with what time we...
I'm sorry, but we are very tight on schedule. We have broken the time limit already.
Just a minute or so. Just
okay, if it's just a minute, then go ahead.
Well, we have a problem. I would like to stop the sharing. Here it is. And to share something different. Here is a clip from Acto de Primavera of Emmanuel de Oliveira. Just
Andai cá ouvir esta. A conquista do espaço e a próxima viagem à Lua. Presseguem os preparativos para a próxima viagem à Lua. Está iminente o envio de um homem à conquista do espaço.
Bem-aventurados os pobres de espírito, porque deles é o reino dos céus.
A primeira tentativa de colocar um homem no espaço será um voo relativamente curto. O astronauta escolhido viajará numa cápsula contida no missílio.
Bem-aventurados os puros de coração, porque verão a Deus.
Depois de tudo correr bem, só poucos viajantes saberá qual será o escolhido para pioneiro do espaço.
Bem-aventurados os que sofrem perseguições por amor da justiça, porque Deus é o reino dos céus.
Pelo segundo dia consecutivo, os cientistas que utilizaram o radiotelescópio gigante têm estado atentos. Quinta-feira Santa, alta paixão.
Oh, estou no suado.
É a seguir.
Ora bem, cuidadinho com a navalha, hein? Nada a ver novidade. Olha que eu tenho um papel importante, é representar no ato.
Também eu, todos nós temos um papel importante neste ato.
This is the Samaritan woman.
Arranjaste um industível.
Beijas.
Who creates the transition between the documentary reality and the pre-modern reality of the medieval play, which is going to be presented in this village. And here the play begins with the meeting between the Samaritan woman and Christ. And we have a different reality and actually a different genre.
Vamos beber.
Como é que tu és judeu impedes de beber sendo eu samaritana?
Se tu soubesses quem eu era, tu me pedirias da minha água. Dessa água que dá vida. E quem beber dessa água jamais terá sede por toda a eternidade.
You can hear the
Não
different
sentes das pedras do meu poço.
mode of enchanting the words when the words are the lines are given by a sacred persona. I will finish with this clip. I have prepared a long list with YouTube clips to illustrate what I have presented as a text, but
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we really have not. Unfortunately, we don't have time.
Yes.
Could you please finish up?
That's I wanted to present to you and thank you for the invitation. I hope in the discussion there will be time to talk about this project.
Professor Anakieva, feel free just to, to share the links if you want in the chat window, and we need to continue with the next speaker. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Anakieva. Next, we have, we're going straight to the next speaker because the time is against us. So it's Tiana Petkovskaya, main philosophical sciences in the field of contemporary philosophy. And she has also completed her an International Academy program in film directing in the Czech Republic. The name of her presentation is The Sublime, the Terrible, and the Ugly, an exploration of cosmic horror in film and in literature. Tiana, you may proceed.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me well? Is everything all right? Can you hear me well? All right.
Yeah, we hear you.
So first, I want to express my gratitude to be invited to be a part of this conference. I'm very pleased.
And also, please let me stress this. Please stick to the 20 minutes time schedule.
I will do my absolute best. I would like to begin with a small preface on my approach and my goal with this presentation and what eventually it might become. Hopefully first an essay and then maybe something more. What I will be presenting today is by far not a finished and fixed meditation on the problems presented in it. It is much rather the beginning stage of a longer investigation on the aesthetic problems of the sublime, the terrible, and the ugly. It's setting the base or an establishing of the foundation in which their interconnectedness can be considered, which is why it is mostly based around the Burkean and Kantian concept of the sublime as a sort of starting platform, and because everyone starts there, for the ways in which the mentioned aesthetic concepts can be considered. Cosmic horror came up as an interesting investigative playing ground where these aesthetic issues can be pitted against each other, so to speak. So in that vein, the explorative function of this presentation has a double meaning, both to explore the dimensions of cosmic horror, as well as to explore the sublime, the terrible, and the ugly, but not to superimpose these categories by all means on this genre. The problem of the sublime has been treated within the realm of Lovecraftian horror, as cosmic horror can otherwise be known, in many ways, but mostly in a dispute whether Immanuel Kant's notion of the sublime can be applied to it or not, an issue with which I will also engage with a little, since I believe that it is important to understand the sublime and the context. So in this presentation, the focus will primarily lay on the connection in the context of film and the cinematic, and I will only mention certain novels in passing. So let us say the playing ground of cosmic horror. Often situated in the meeting between horror, dark fantasy, and science fiction, cosmic horror seems to have eluded more precise genre definitions. It is in a way of subgenre, some think of horror, some of science fiction, with very few examples that capture that which is unmistakably cosmic horror. A few staples of the genre remain across the board, however, mostly influenced by its forerunner, Howard Phillips Lovecraft, but for the most part, it is open to a wide range of interpretation, or this is something I believe. In fact, the more specific it gets, the less it incorporates the greater possibilities of its base themes in an aesthetic and a philosophical way, and the more it can fall into pulp and camp characteristic for genre fiction and relating to both style and concept, which is, camp is not necessarily a bad thing. But Lovecraftian horror, as a part of weird fiction, operates in different dimensions of the horrific, and as it changes, or as the genre's mantle has been passed on to other authors and artists, so its relationship with the sublime further develops or changes. And not just the sublime, but with theme, style, and so on. Well, I will not be considering these changes that occur within the genre itself, nor present a complete account of his working so far. I would like to note that my view on what can be called a work of cosmic horror incorporates works that are not generally considered as such, mostly again because of the base that Lovecraft has already placed and seems to be treated as kind of a paradigm and canon. The films which I will mention, on which I base my analysis, are not all considered part of the cosmic horror genre. For instance, while John Carpenter's The Thing is in film a good representation of cosmic horror, the book on which it was based on is considered a classic of sci-fi, but not necessarily cosmic horror. Alex Garland's Annihilation, the second film I will mention, is based as well on a book, one of a trilogy. And this trilogy has a different place within cosmic horror. It's a part of what is called the new weird, or that kind of change or development within cosmic horror and weird fiction. The third one, which I will talk about, is Tarkovsky's Stalker. So Stalker is a completely different matter. Well, I will not be arguing that it is some example of cosmic horror that has somehow fallen through the cracks and is to be considered a neglected piece of cosmic horror. I believe that both Stalker and Roadside Picnic, which is sorry, I became muted. Can you hear me now?
I'm sorry, Tiana. I tried to mute someone that had the microphone on, but it was a mistake. I'm sorry.
All right. So I was talking about Stalker and Roadside Picnic, the novel it was based on. I believe that they share some striking similarities with, and in some of their aspects with cosmic horror that can help further understand the genre and the aesthetic problems I will be dealing with in this presentation. Again, unfortunately, I won't have too much time to go into too much of a comparative analysis, but that will remain later for the essay. So one of the core ideas within cosmic horror, and the ideas that I'm most interested in, is the idea of the first contact with an alien civilization, even though civilization is a bit of a stretch and can be a dubious term in this context. So an alien civilization far more advanced, or in some other way, shape, or form, superior, which is to mean stronger or more powerful to humankind. The horror aspect of the genre takes advantage of this imbalance or contrast between humankind and that which is alien to it. The alien taking monstrous shape, a shape which is more often than not difficult to even comprehend, even especially in its magnitude and its power, is a kind of attacker or violator of the perceived normalcy or reality of nature and with that of humankind. Many themes arise from this conflict of sorts and are explored in various ways in cosmic horror, and one might say in horror and science fiction even more generally. But most importantly, the mentioned imbalance between human and alien, being, force, thing, which is an important ambiguity and obscurity in definition, or the minuscule versus the gargantuan, whether in size or force, is also a source for experiencing sublimity within that context. Certain ambiguities that exist in the genre give it that nuance and further dimension that surpass the guttural response of fear. So if we consider cosmic horror as an artistic and philosophical setting that would allow for magnificent questions and problems to be posed, some of which grounded, others abstract, and some, well, weird and curious. So how do we consider the aesthetic categories in film? Furthermore, how can we approach this problem in the unique aesthetic experience of cosmic horror? To answer simply, but without simplification, we shall consider the aesthetic categories not as set parameters working in an either-or fashion, but rather in the forming and transforming experience through the cinematic and temporal dimension of film. I mean, it is a little bit of an oversimplification, but for the sake of time. When it concerns the sublime and the terrible directly, Edmund Burke already opens the possibility of such an understanding of these two categories, where in his sensualist approach to the problem, he starts distinguishing sublimity from beauty and places the sublime and the terrible in the same class of the passions, that of self-preservation. And I will quote here: "Whatever is fitted of any sort to excite the ideas of pain and danger, that is to say, whatever is of any sort terrible, or is conversant about terrible objects, or operates in a manner analogous to terror, is a source of the sublime. That is, it is productive of the strongest emotion which the mind is capable of feeling." End quotation. The major difference between the two being is the most obvious one, the relation and closeness of said pain and danger. This difference brings us to Immanuel Kant's view on the sublime, which was inherently influenced by Burke, though greatly transformed within the context of his philosophy. So experiencing sublimity, from his point of view, though limited within the arts and found mostly in nature, is a kind of negative experience or negative pleasure, by the ways of both attracting and repulsing the experiencing subject. Umberto Eco, in his recounting of the history of ugliness, I believe, finds the connection of the sublime and the ugly precisely in this negative pleasure. So when he considers the romantic astonishment with the ugly as the uncanny, the mysterious, or the sinister. In Burke, we find it as the delightful horror of sublimity. So it is in that sense of the word that we can speak of the interconnectedness of the sublime, the terrible, and the ugly. Furthermore, the cinematic movement disallows the formation of a single homogeneous experience throughout. This is something I believe, but rather moves both the imagination and the mind, as well as sensation, through the action of story, concept, and let's call it the audio-visual faculties of the medium itself. The barrier between the sublime and the terrible becomes increasingly leaner as the experiencing subject moves in congruity with the cinematic. Can cosmic horror also allow for a seeming indivisibility between the two, or are the instances of experiencing appearing as fused, just to be outrun by the sheer effective force of terror, stopping the possibility of forming appropriate distance for contemplative pleas to delight in the sublime? This is something that's especially prevalent, I think, in film, more so than literature. The final experience of the sublime, meeting of this distance, for Immanuel Kant happens on the basis of the affirmation of the faculties of reason of the experiencing subject. So this is the triumph of reason over imagination in their free play, or I would say even battle. And it is itself the affirmation of the human subject as superior to even nature. This anthropocentric perspective, while completely in line with Kant's project and the humanism of the Enlightenment, stands in contrast with the anti-anthropocentric and anti-humanism usually to be found and even expected in cosmic horror. In fact, some authors are critical of the possibility of a Kantian reading of the sublime in cosmic horror, state that the principle of cosmic indifference found in Lovecraftian cosmicism, not to be conflated with Russian cosmism, negates such a reading at all. The cosmic indifference isn't to be contrasted to aesthetic indifference, which we find in the contemplation of beauty and the critique of the power of judgment, nor should they be equalized. The indifference in cosmicism is that of the contrasts, is that which contrasts the moral feeling in the further affirmation of the subject found in the work of Kant. It is the indifference of the starry sky to the human being, the indifference of the monstrous and gargantuan alien force or thing to the minuscule existence of the human and humankind. Any appeal to the moral feeling within us is an appeal meant only to drive on to madness. In fact, there are two ways to leave this clash of moral feeling and cosmic indifference in cosmic horror. One is in ugliness and madness, and the other in the acceptance of a state beyond good and evil, in the acceptance of the change which can occur in the turn towards that which is alien. Now, this second aspect is more prominent in the New Weird and the fiction of Jeff Vandermeer. This is the author of the Southern Ridge trilogy on which the film Annihilation is based. And in Lovecraft, we can find most often the first resolution, so to speak. I believe that a Lovecraftian resolution which finds madness after confronting that which causes the human subject to be in fact subjugated to the power and vastness of the cosmos is exactly a true left from modernity, which does not negate the importance of the subject, but rather affirms its reason to the point where it breaks when faced with alterity or that which is other to it or completely inexplicable. While the sublime turn might not be experienced, the subject, though so to speak tormented, still remains. So let us take a moment and clarify the problem of the ugly a little bit more. Unlike the sublime and the terrible, it lives in the embodiment of the image. It is the image of horror itself, I believe. It is also a part, especially when it comes to cosmic horror, it is also a part of the equation of inference of the terrible and the sublime. As mentioned, it is an aspect of the break or the transformation when the human is faced with the magnitude of that which is difficult, if not impossible, to understand. In cosmic horror, this is actualized in the form of what is called body gore. So it is the gruesome transformation of the human body into the other. In both The Thing and Annihilation, this holds the pivotal aspects of the horrific, the sinister, the uncanny, as the ugly. Both films, as well as the books, explicate on the gruesome matter in detail, but in both instances, the transformation happens within a crucial constraint. In order to be transformed, the human must first be mirrored or refracted in body, but also in mind. So the maxim show, don't tell, which filmmakers are very fond of, and which in a way connects to a lot of what was said today, but I will not go too much into that, works in quite a literal sense when it comes to the ugly and when it comes to cosmic horror, with Carpenter sharing such bursts of wisdom and I'm paraphrasing, if you have a great monster, why not show it? And this is also a simplification. And that's exactly what he does in The Thing, in full light with practical effects, stretching the limits of the human alien body in scenes that, while might not have aged perfectly well, grasp that which is both eerie familiar and utterly unfamiliar in one inexplicable creature. Carpenter certainly does horror justice in this film, but the sublime and the terrible don't have such a relationship either with the inexplicable or with representation. Moreover, the sublime in both film and genre fiction literature seems to live in those moments of inference that happen somewhere in between the mixing lines of the ugly and the terrible. Again, the problem of the visual nature of film itself poses a kind of difficulty when searching for sublimity within it. And in cosmic horror, this is twice the problem, because it uses its best tool to explicate on the inconceivable, the tool being ugliness, to stimulate both fear and repulsion. So does it leave even less room for the required distancing of the experiencing subject to occur? Contrasted to that, in The New Weird, the Southern Reach trilogy contrasted to rather the first resolution, the resolution of madness and ugliness, even though ugliness is present for sure in the Southern Reach trilogy and the Annihilation, the film based on one of the books. So in The New Weird, in the Southern Ridge trilogy, the last book is named Acceptance. And this shows a kind of vitalist interpretation to the change in an exceedingly anti-anthropocentric manner. So can the sublime not be found in this acceptance as well? In a poignant scene from the film Annihilation, when the main protagonist is left alone with one of her companions, thinking about the expedition in this mysterious area where all these inconceivable things happen, and thinking how they should proceed, her companion, before transfiguring into the area itself, says, Ventress wants to fight it, or Ventress wants to face it, you want to fight it, but I don't think I want either of those things. And this is also, there's also a huge difference in the visual approach in the film as to that, as to Carpenter's approach. So the question is, what do we really see in cosmic horror? Is it a clash of the modern and postmodern? And when I say postmodern, I mean, I use the term in quotation marks, and I use it to denote the differentiation of the treatment of the subject in both an epistemological and an aesthetic sense of the word. Or is it a border not fully crossed, since cosmic horror and the sublime still operate with some of the tools of the modern, both in a narrative and a representational manner? It is as if we are seeing the moments of the break as transfiguration of value beyond good and evil, beyond beauty and ugliness, kalokagathia, and towards a heterogeneous complexity of that which can be neither. And now I've reached the end. I hope I haven't gone too much over. And at the end, I'm perfectly aware that the presentation hasn't delivered a full account of what was promised maybe in the title. And I know that I ask more questions than I actually provide answer. So I leave cosmic horror and the sublime as mysterious as ever. And again, instead of a conclusion, I will leave you with a final image from Stalker. Unfortunately, I won't show you, I will recount the image of Stalker. There is nothing more perplexing than feeling the vague borderline between the rising delight and the sublime and its seeming counterpart terror when experiencing something akin to cosmic horror. A scene which I believe illustrates this borderline perfectly is one from Stalker that comes almost at the end of the film, after the trio of characters have already been through their journey and have entered deeply into the zone. This is a scene which leads me to believe that we can and should speak of this film in the context of cosmic horror at all. It is that one moment of eerie serenity when the characters are finally faced with the mysterious room, the inexplicable remainder of an alien passerby, and at that point something already contextualized for them in a completely different manner, and so is for the audience. This is a moment in which we, the audience, have a double role to play. We see the perplexed and tormented faces of the characters peering at the room, and through them we experience the sheer force and potential of what it might represent to them, which is probably terrible. Our second role as the audience is to be peered at by the characters with their perplexed faces. So Tarkovsky puts us in a very strange situation. He gives us neither terror nor delight in this moment. But can we not experience both? So yeah, I will end on that. Thank you for your attention and your patience. I hope I made some sense.
Thank you, Diana, for introducing us to the horror genre and the implications on film, cinema, and philosophy through the lens of ugliness, sublime, and grandeur, if I may say so. Now we have seriously exceeded our time limit, so I want to consult with Anna. Do we have time for a small discussion, or do we incorporate this small discussion into the general discussion after the third session?
What I will propose is that maybe we use the next 6-7 minutes. We try to round up somewhere around 2:30. If everyone is okay with it, and if you have some direct and pressing question, it would be nice to just have it fresh, pose them now.
But if you have brief questions,
and then for the rest of it, like, we are going to continue this the discussion afterwards, after the third session.
I thought
so yeah, if someone has a question, feel free to jump in.
Yep.
We have the time.
The floor is yours. You don't need to raise your hand, just go ahead and unmute yourself and comment or ask question or anything. Or is everybody just too tired right now?
Probably everyone is quite hungry. Then what I would propose is that maybe we start the break now, and then we just go and have a bigger general discussion. As we have a bit broken the time limit for the session, is it possible that we maybe meet 15 minutes later than what it was scheduled for the third session? So instead of 3 o'clock, if I'm correct, just I'm going to check, we meet at 3:15, if that's all right for everyone.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Fine with me.
Then have a lunch, bon appetit, and we see each other in some 45-50 minutes. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.